All right. Well, welcome everybody. We are now going to be diving into the fourth of our 5 sessions here of trekking through the Old Testament. So before we get going, I want to pray for us, and then I'll give us a little bit of a preview of where all we're heading tonight, and then we'll dive into it. I would actually anticipate that tonight's going to be a little bit shorter than the previous 3, just because I have less material that we're needing to work through that's in the Bible. So we're going to be doing less reading from the scriptures and more just kind of talking about history. So we've got that to look forward to. So let me pray for us, and then we will dive into it. Father, I thank you even for today and the rest that we got with just the rain and being able to enjoy creation wherever we may be in today. God, I thank you for the opportunity that we have now with clear weather and being able to gather together, whether we are physically here together or gathering online. God, that we are able to come to look at what it is that you have done in history. God, I pray that as we are walking through this, frankly, difficult period of history for Israel, that God, that we would be able to see your guiding hand and your influence and the way in which you are sovereign over all the nations. God, I pray that that would become clear to us. God, I also ask that as we are working through this, that you would give us all clarity of thought, with me especially, being able to cover all this material. God, I pray that what I say would be accurate and beneficial. I pray that we would be able to take what it is that we see here to be able to turn that back into praise and more fervent love for you. God, I pray that that would happen. I pray that you would be honored by what we say and do tonight. And God, I ask that you would be here with us. And we pray all this in your son's name. Amen. All right, so for any of y'all who are joining us online, or if you're watching this after the fact, down in the description you'll see the slides that we're going to be working through. So let us dive into that right now. So we're going to recap a little bit from last week before we get going, and then dive into where we're heading. So for us tonight, we're going to be talking about the divided kingdom all the way to Persian ascent. To where the Medo-Persian Empire, we'll just call them the Persians, whenever they are on the stage and they're actually the major player in the ancient Near East. We're going to do that by talking, and this is where we're going to recap about how the kingdom was divided from this one singular monarchy under Saul, David, and then Solomon, and then it splits. We're going to talk about Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the 2 kings that are going to have that split occur under their watch. We're going to talk about the Assyrians, the Assyrians who are on the ascent, and the Syrian Empire that's on the descent, Israel and how they are destroyed. And then we're going to talk about this really weird thing that happens in Judah's history with Ahaz and how impressed he is with Damascus, because it's all tied up into the ascent of the Assyrians, the destruction of the northern kingdom, and the downfall of the southern kingdom. It all kind of encapsulates all those things at once. After we get done talking about that, we're going to talk about Josiah and his reforms and his death. We're going to talk a little bit about Hezekiah, but Josiah is like the figure that we're really going to latch on to. We're going to talk about the Babylonians coming up on the rise, the Assyrians on the decline, Judah's destruction under the hands of the Babylonians, talk about the captivity in Babylon, and then we're going to talk about the Persians coming on to the scene. Make sense? So let me just ask this right out the gate. When I talk about the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians, how many of y'all feel like you have a fairly decent idea of who we're talking about here? All right, so if I had a good map up here, it would be really great to have it to refer back to the whole time. I don't have that, so if you got it on your phone, just pull up a map of the ancient Near East, and you can pull up the Babylonian Empire, you can pull up the Assyrian Empire. Do that whenever we're walking along through this, and I'm going to do my best to kind of just like broadly gesticulate where they were, because this is going to be really important to understand physically where these folks are situated in relation to each other. Yep? So if you want to do that, pull your phone out, rock on. All right, so let us recap where we were last night. We went all the way from Judges to the very end of the monarchy, the decline of Solomon and his death. And then we see that the kingdom was being divided. And this is actually the slide from last time. So let me just kind of recap it. We see that this cat named Jeroboam, who was a servant of Solomon, he's not in the family, he's not in the royal family. He runs into this prophet, and a prophet tells him, hey, you're going to be given 10 tribes. And that's where we see that foretelling that the nation is going to split, where Israel will be in the north and Judah will be in the south, right? But God's going to remember his promise to David, and that eventually this is exactly what happens. Rehoboam, who is Solomon's son, is initially actually recognized by the 10 northern tribes, but then they say, hey man, can you cut us a break? And he doesn't do it. He makes a foolish decision to actually make the requirements on those 10 northern tribes even more punishing, frankly. And because of that, whenever Jeroboam, who was on the run, he comes back from Egypt, whenever he lands in the northern kingdom, they rebel and they say, you know what, Jeroboam, you're our king now. Does that make sense? So that's where we are. But we didn't really talk very much about Jeroboam or Rehoboam, so let's do that now. So it's more proper to really talk about Rehoboam and then Jeroboam, because Rehoboam is actually he is the heir to the entire kingdom. He is Solomon's son. So let's just get this out the way. One, Rehoboam is and should be the rightful heir. He is actually going to be the one who rules in Judah in the south, right? Jeroboam, who is the usurper, the one who comes and takes the crown for himself, he is ruling in Israel in the north. All right, this is not how it's meant to be. Rehoboam was supposed to have everything, but because of Solomon's sin and his unwillingness to remain faithful to the covenant of God, he gets the kingdom taken away from him. But because God remembers the covenant that he made to David, Solomon's dad, said, I'm never going to leave the throne without a ruler from Judah or from your household, boom. So he keeps Rehoboam around to rule Judah and Benjamin down in the south, okay? So this is the next big thing that we need to see. We're going to be hanging out in 1 Kings for our first little bit, and then we're going to jump all the way to 2 Kings, and we're going to camp out there for the rest of the night, essentially. We'll peek into Jeremiah a time or two, maybe even into Daniel, but we're really going to be looking at 1 Kings right now, and then eventually to 2 Kings. So let's do that right now. Go to 1 Kings chapter 12. We're going to pick it up in chapter 12, verse 26, right then. Let's pick it up in verse 25. Then Jeroboam, the usurper, the guy who was hiding in Egypt, who came back and he's in the northern kingdom with 10 tribes. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim. And remember, Ephraim is just one of the tribes, but a lot of times that's just referring to the northern kingdom, Ephraim. And he lived there. And he went out from there and he built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up, speaking of Jerusalem, go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of his people will turn again to the Lord and to Rehoboam, the king of Judah. And they will kill me, and they will return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So this is basically what's going on. He recognizes that, like, now that we've split, we got a problem. Because we're all actually the same people. We are all of the same nation. We're all cousins in that regard. We all have the same God. We all have the same religious lineage. Well, in our religious lineage, the one place that worship is supposed to happen is down south at the temple in Jerusalem. Well, that's in a whole other country as it is now. And if I allow my people to go down there to worship the Lord in fidelity, then they're just going to, they're going to rebel against me and they're going to flee right back to Rehoboam. And he can't have that, because if that happens, he loses his kingdom. Pick it up in verse 28. So the king took counsel and he made 2 calves of gold. What story should that remind you of? This is literally the exact thing that happens whenever Moses is on top of Mount Sinai receiving the covenant, and he comes down the hill and Aaron had gathered everybody's gold, and the hole threw the gold in and like a golden calf popped out. But not to be outdone, instead of getting 1 golden calf, he actually creates 2. So the king took counsel and he made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel, which is down in the south, and the other he put in Dan, which is way up north. And then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to go be before one. So basically what Jeroboam does is he sets up these 2 golden calves, and they are now going to usher in a new priesthood and a whole new set of idols. This is where everything is this is the point when Israel is lost, essentially, already. You split the kingdom, and then the guy who is supposed to restrain the evil of the people is actively participating, not just in their evil with morality, but also with religious fervor. I mean, he even goes so far as to say, behold the gods who brought you up out of Egypt, when literally the last time one of these things were around, Moses crushed that thing up, burned it with fire, and made everyone drink of it, right? But now, those are the 2 calves that actually brought you up out of Egypt. You see the arrogance here. And the whole point of this is because he has to hold on to the northern kingdom. Because if the people keep going down south and they start worshiping the right way and they get right with God, now I got a problem. As we've said the last 3 nights, this is not a practical problem. It is a theological problem, right? It keeps coming back to this spiritual fidelity of the people. It just happens to be displayed in such a random, like on the face of it, obviously evil thing. But that's what happens. So there's this new priesthood that's set up. It's no longer about Aaron and the Levites. We're going to create this whole new order of priests, and they're going to be our priests. Yeah? So here's what I want you to see. That's bad. And we would like to say, okay, Rehoboam is the rightful king, Jeroboam is not. Jeroboam's the one who sets up the calves. He's bad. Well, Rehoboam, who was good, clearly he must have been holding to spiritual fidelity. Turn to chapter 14 for me real quick. Chapter 14, let's pick it up in verse 21. Now, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city that the Lord had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite. And Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins that they committed more than all that their fathers had done. For they also built for themselves high places and pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were also made a male cult of prostitutes in the land, and they did accordingly to all the abominations of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. So Rehoboam is immediately doing the exact same things that his father Solomon had started. Remember, Solomon's got 700 wives, 300 concubines, and all of them are different religions, and he just starts, grab bag buffet style of religion, and he starts worshiping different gods. This is what we see going on with Rehoboam. So in many ways, this is when the southern kingdom is lost. Like, this is where everything gets completely off the rails. Now, it's going to take a couple hundred years before we actually see that come to fruition with the Babylonians, but it's the exact same story, just playing out 2 different ways. One's a little more on the face of it, just like, clearly you should have seen how bad this was. And then with Rehoboam, clearly we should have seen how bad it was, but at least it's not 2 golden calves, right? However, if you keep reading in that story, actually, let's just hold it right there. When we talk about idol worship, I'm not going to talk much about minor prophets, but this is where guys like Amos and Hosea and all the minor prophets who are railing against idol worship, this is the kind of junk they're talking about. These high places, these Asherim poles, this Asherah poles under every green tree and on every high hill. Like, this is the type of stuff that lingers for generations that they're going to be contending with later. Yeah? So this is where it begins, with Solomon and then Rehoboam. Basically, back it up even further, the author of 1st and 2nd Kings condemns every single king in Israel and every single king in Judah except 2, which are Hezekiah and Josiah, which we'll talk about tonight, for not destroying these high places, these Asherim poles, these places of idol worship. Every single king, minus 2. What more could we anticipate that God is going to do with his people who have so blatantly broken covenantal faithfulness? Going all the way back to Joshua and Jericho. It's not about tactics. It's not a practical problem. It's a theological problem. When you are spiritually faithful to us and their fidelity is there and clear, then I'll give you success. But when you don't, what could we anticipate would happen? So even now, going back to where we've talked about already, when we start seeing the black hat and the white hat and you start knowing what's going to be happening, we should be anticipating some themes to crop up, like, well, man, maybe God should judge. Maybe he should eventually show up and that there would be this eventual rescue. That does happen. It just takes a lot longer than we think. But in some cases, it doesn't, which brings us to our next point. So Rehoboam follows immediately in Solomon's steps. However, look in the very next verses, starting in verse 25 of chapter 14. Now, in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away the shields of gold that Solomon had made, and King Rehoboam made in their place shields of bronze, and then he committed them to the hands of the officers of the guard who kept the door of the king's house. So what ends up happening is the temple and the palace are utterly plundered by Shishak. So there's almost like this immediate response by God. So the very thing that was all this splendor of Solomon's temple, like literally the shields were like gold plated, well, they took them away, and because we don't have any gold anymore, we're just going to make them out of bronze. So you can already see a cheapening of what it is that God already is wanting for his people, with them trying to replace it with their best. And I think we asked the question the other night, where did all that gold go into the temple? And I told you, well, it changes hands several times. Here's one of the very first times that the temple was looted. It's not the last time. Definitely won't be the last time, okay? But there's almost this immediate recompense for Rehoboam's sin. Not only that, a lot of the fortresses that Solomon had built across the land and that Rehoboam had been building, Shishak is actually going to go destroy. So all of that security that was in the nation as a unified nation, the prosperity, the golden age, all the cultural achievements, all the writing, all the architecture, all that good stuff that Solomon had built is already starting to crumble 5 years into this thing. Already. And this is the guy who's of the line of David. Like, you should see like how difficult this would have been for people who were still faithful to God to be living in the nation at that time, to see this going on and how heartbreaking it was. And that's whenever you read prophets like Amos or Hosea, and they are railing against idol worship, is because they're seeing the immediate effects of it. Let's back up just a second here. I haven't done a lot of preaching from up here in the last couple of nights, but here's the one place I'll do it. We do the exact same thing. We do the exact same thing. We may not see the immediate consequences every time, but when we see the consequences, I think more times than not, we want to pull back and say, well, it really wasn't all that bad what I did. Whenever we put something above our relationship with God, we do the exact same thing. Now, is it a golden calf or two? Probably not, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't fall into the exact same ditch that both of these dudes do. Are you tracking with that? So before we start casting stones in the Old Testament, looking at Jeroboam and Rehoboam and saying, how could they, just stop and think for a moment and ask, when did I? And you'll find that you did the exact same thing. Yeah? So, you can go read in 2 Chronicles chapter 11, 5 through 12, where the Shishak actually destroys all these fortresses. I'm telling you, we're not going to read in a lot of these places because there's way too much for us to cover there. So we cool on Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And you can actually see where the fissures within the country, and then essentially what's going to happen with them, ultimately with Assyria and Babylon, they're already doomed in some sense, right? They're basically doomed because of what's going on here. All right, so let's talk about what practically happens when something like this takes place. When a country that was unified then splits. You can see this in history all the time. Whenever there is an opportunity or a vacuum in the power, there is going to be someone that fills that. Are you tracking with that? So, let's talk about Jeroboam. Let's go read 1 Kings chapter 13. Go back one chapter. Let's pick it up in 13. Let's pick it up in verse 1. And behold, a man of God came out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel, and Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make offerings at the golden calf, right? So a prophet of God comes to him when he is right there in the middle of his idol worship. Verse 2, and the man cried against the altar by the word of the Lord and said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name. Hold on to that. And he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places and make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, this is the sign that the Lord has spoken. Behold, the altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are on it shall be poured out. And when the king, Jeroboam, the usurper, when he heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried against the altar at Bethel, Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, seize him. Y'all grab this dude, go kill him. And as he's stretching his hand out, he could not draw it back to himself. There's this miraculous thing that happens that like his arm is just stuck and he can't do anything about it. what happens there is that Jeroboam's sin is absolutely confronted in the middle of his sin. And what the promise is being made there is that Israel is going to be destroyed. Because of what you are doing right now, there's going to be someone who's going to come later, metaphorically in this regard, and they are going to sacrifice you on that altar. Everything that you're trying to protect by doing this is going to die because you're doing this. Are you tracking with that? And so he says that Israel is going to be destroyed, and Josiah is going to be the one who's going to be the one to destroy idol worship. We'll talk about him in 2 Kings later in the night. So just hold on to him. But from the onset, we already see Rehoboam is already making the same mistakes that Solomon did. Jeroboam's already too deep in it, and he actually gets confronted in the middle of it. And is told basically from the get, yeah, this is all going to burn down because of what you're doing. Yeah? When that happens, there's an opportunity for Israel's enemies to step up. Because there's already weakness because the country's not unified. And what do you think Jeroboam's response is going to be whenever he's told, hey, everything you're trying to protect is about to go south? What do you think he's going to do? Be like, well, I guess we just let it happen. Or is he going to become really paranoid? Is he going to really start trying to protect what he's already gained? Is he going to go even further than he did before to try to hold on to what he had? Well, when that happens, it just gets further and further away, man. The harder he tries to hold on to it, the more it slips out of his fingers. And so what's going on during this time is the Armenian states that are just north of Israel in the northern kingdom, they start growing. They, at one time, along with Ammon and Moab, were vassals of Solomon, right? They were paying Solomon money so that he didn't go and destroy them, right? So they paid tribute. Well, now that Solomon's dead, and your boy down in the south can't hold us to account, and neither can Jeroboam, we got our independence back. And then Syria. When I say Syria, you should think Damascus, even present day. It's the same general location, kind of north and a little bit northeast of Israel. Talking about Syria, they are a constant threat. They've always been kind of lurking in the background. They'd always had their claws kind of dug in with Tyre and Sidon and a couple of different places there near Lebanon. They'd always have influence there, but now that the northern kingdom is kind of on their own because the southern kingdom ain't going to help them, right? They're fighting each other. There's going to be this opportunity for all these enemies to step in and influence areas where they previously hadn't had any influence. Tracking with that? This is going to be a pattern we're going to see just in history. This isn't even like a biblical thing necessarily, but just historically, practically, this happens all the time, and you're starting to watch it unfold in real time. Yeah? Tracking with that? All right. So, let's talk about Assyria and Syria. First thing we need to figure out is who these people are right there. The Akkadian Empire. The Akkadian Empire, basically think about what present-day Turkey is, all the way to where the headwaters of the Euphrates and the Tigris River, the area called Mesopotamia. Do you know what Mesopotamia actually means, what the literal translation of that word means? It means the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, right? So you think about what is present-day Turkey or Asia Minor in the we'll refer to later on, all the way to the headwaters of Mesopotamia. That was an old empire called the Akkadian Empire, and they stretched influence all the way up to the Black Sea, up in the Caucasus Mountains even, right? So these guys were old. They basically spawned both Syria and Assyria. Whenever the Akkadian Empire starts to fall, Assyria and Syria start to take over their place. Assyria is basically kind of where we would have Nineveh going all the way into Turkey, and in the present-day Turkey, and then Syria kind of had from Nineveh south, right? So what happens next is that Syria had really close trading ties with Egypt. When you think about the major powers in this area, you've got Israel kind of right here in the middle, the Mediterranean Sea. You've got Egypt over here, Damascus and Syria, and then you've got Assyria a little bit further up here, right? I know it's backwards to y'all because I'm pointing it out for myself. But either way, Syria has really close trading ties with Egypt. Well, in between them are not only Israel and Judah at this point, but there's also the Hittites. And so there's a battle called the Battle of Kadesh where Egypt and the Hittites are having a fight because Egypt no longer has the trading route all the way to Damascus like they want. Problem is, that battle ends in a draw. Egypt couldn't assert dominance, neither could the Hittites. And the reason the Hittites couldn't do it was because the Syrians weren't able to come down and help them. That's a problem. The reason the Syrians couldn't help them is because they were already losing their economic dominance in the area. Are you tracking with that? Just basic, history 101 type stuff. The battle was a draw. The Syrians were losing their trade dominance, and that opens the door for Assyria. And Assyria, now that they had collected and consolidated the power, they now have this opportunity, and they start to dominate economically. They start running right down the coast of the Mediterranean straight to Egypt. They have a highway that they just run right through it because they don't have to go through the Hittites. They don't have to go through Jerusalem. They don't have to go through Israel or Judah. They can just run right down the coast. And when they do that, they start getting their claws in a whole bunch of other places. Eventually, what ends up happening, whenever you have the Asia Minor and Turkey and all the way over to the headwaters of the Tigris and the Euphrates, you know what happens whenever you take those rivers south? Who do you run into? The Babylonians. And so what the Assyrians do is they actually sack Babylon. They sack multiple temples. The same thing that happened to the temple in Israel with Shikash, that cat we mentioned earlier from Egypt. The same thing happens to multiple temples in Babylon. And so Assyria is clearly on the rise. Syria is shrinking. Because the way that happens is Syria has a couple of tribes here and there, different groups that are loyal to them. But whenever they see the writing on the wall that I can either pay you and then fight that guy and we die, or I can pay this guy and fight you and I'll win. So they just switch sides, right? We're going to see that happen all the time in the ancient Near East. All that being said, Assyria is on the rise, and there's one name you need to remember, Tiglath-Pileser. Tiglath-Pileser, and technically Tiglath-Pileser III is who this cat is in history. The Bible actually uses this name, calls him Puel a couple of times, or Pul, but it's the same dude, right? This guy eventually will destroy Syria. There's a couple of battles that'll take place in Haran and then right outside Damascus. He actually is going to eventually destroy Syria. And this is where we see Assyria really put their stamp on the world. They are here. They just knocked out the only other major power in the area. The twist in all this is that he does so because Ahaz, the king of Judah, is asking for his help. And the reason he's asking for his help, we'll see here in just a moment, but he's asking for help because Israel, to the north, was actually using Syria to funnel troops down to fight a war with them. There was a civil war going on, and the main ally of Israel at the time was Syria. So what is Judah left to do? You've only got two options. You either talk to the Egyptians, which you kind of hate, or you can talk to this new group that's up there called the Assyrians, and you get them to not attack Israel, but you have them to attack Syria. That's exactly what they do, and Tiglath destroys them. So now you've got Assyria, and that's it. Make sense? So they are the major dominant power. They make Syria a vassal state. You know what I mean when I say a vassal, right? Are you tracking with that? A vassal is someone that you have conquered, but instead of utterly destroying them, you have them pay you a yearly or every 2 or 3 year tribute. They pay you money so that you don't go in there and kill everybody, right? So it makes them a vassal. And so now Assyria is clearly the ones who are on the rise. The Battle of Kadesh is when Assyria really takes over Syria, and the Battle of Haran, okay? You can look those up in history. Fascinating all on their own. Don't have time for doing it right now. Cool? All right, so let's talk about Ahaz, because this is one of those really weird stories that kind of takes place all at the same time. From here on out, everything we're going to be talking about with the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, Assyria, Babylon, all of it's going to be happening at the exact same time. Right? Even whenever you're reading in 1st and 2nd Kings, which we're actually going to be in 2nd Kings, so if you want to turn there, just go to 2nd Kings chapter 16. Everything that's going on in chapters 13 on in 2nd Kings is going to take a couple of chapters to look at the northern kingdom, and then we'll look at the southern kingdom, and then we reference the previous king, and we talk about where we are now back in the north, and then we jump back to the south, even though they're happening at the same time. Right? It's just one of those natural problems that you have in narrative when you're trying to describe something that is happening in 2 different locations at the same time, okay? So chronology may get a little screwy here, but just keep in mind all this is happening at the same time. All right. The southern kingdom is where we're going to find ourselves here with Ahaz. Chronologically, we have now moved from 1 Kings to 2 Kings. We've skipped a whole bunch of those kings, generally because they're worthless. They're all worthless, every one of them, right? The author of 1 and 2 Kings condemns every single one of them, right? So let's not waste our breath on them and just jump to the point where it's going to be useful for us. So let's pick it up in 2 Kings chapter 16, starting verse 1. In the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. So all that to say, here is Ahaz. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord his God, as his father David had done. Which, by the way, that's the phrase, as his father David. That's pointing back to the lineage all the way back from Rehoboam, Solomon to David. Even though there's a dozen kings in between them, they're in the line of David. So this is still showing God's covenantal faithfulness to David when he had promised him that he would always have someone on the throne, right? So, verse 3, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. So there's actually an indictment saying he's just as bad as the guys up north. Yeah, they got golden calves up there, but this dude's just as bad, right? He even burned his son as an offering, according to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. Ahaz, the king of Judah, burns his son alive. And by the way, Ahaz is a bad dude. There's a couple other kings where this kind of happens, where they make living sacrifices. Literally, they burn people alive, and they sacrifice their wives or children most likely. But this guy really stands out as a dirtbag in his own category, right? But notice that he also makes offerings and sacrifices under all those green trees and on top of every high hill, because that's exactly what Rehoboam started way back when. Are you tracking with this? So in many ways, this is just kind of the logical conclusion. Like, why would we think that they would get gradually better after floating into idolatry? No, they're going to get worse. So this guy is going to get attacked. Tiglath-Pileser III comes to the aid of Ahaz, and he destroys Syria. So let's pick it up there in chapter 16. Go down to the very next verse. Then Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to wage war on Jerusalem. Israel, the northern kingdom, and Syria are now going to fight the southern kingdom, Judah. And they besieged Ahaz, but they could not conquer him. So they besieged him. They laid siege to Jerusalem, but they couldn't break the walls. Well, they just needed more time. Well, Ahaz doesn't have all that much time. So what he does is he sends a messenger up to Tiglath-Pileser, and this is what we see next. Verse 6, at that time, Rezin, the king of Syria, recovered Elath from Syria and drove the men of Judah from Elath and the Edomites from Elath, and there, where they dwell to this day. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel who are attacking me. And so Ahaz took the silver and the gold that was found in the house of the Lord. So this time they don't even have to plunder it. We're just going to send it to you. He takes the gold from the temple and he takes the gold and the silver from the king's house and sent a present to the king of Assyria. Hey man, I'm good for it. You know how good I am? Even if you say no, here, just have this. Do whatever you want with it. I'm just saying, there's more where that came from. It's basically what's happening here. And so he sent this as a present. Where are we at? Verse 11. Actually, no. Let's go back to verse 8. And Ahaz took the silver and gold and Lord and treasures house, and sent a present to the king of Assyria. Verse 9. And the king of Assyria listened to him, and the king of Assyria marched up against Damascus and took it, carrying its people captive to Kir, and killed Rezin. And this is where you see the capital is fallen, but the army is still out there, right? Part of it's down there at Jerusalem, right? And so this is where you have Kadesh and Haran, is where you have the rest of the battles where the armies are destroyed, and that's when Syria is officially wiped off the map, right? But here's the deal. So now Ahaz, after he's liberated, right, Israel doesn't have the stomach for the fight anymore because they don't have the men. So they're going to pull back. The war is effectively over. But now Ahaz needs to go meet with Tiglath-Pileser and, tell him thank you. Got to see him face to face. I'm your son, right? You got to come see me. Well, where they meet is in Damascus, and he goes and tours all the temples in Damascus. And he is utterly impressed. And so what he does is he literally has people walking around drawing pictures of what their altars look like and what their temples look like, and he sends it back to the high priest at the temple in Jerusalem and says, hey, make me one of those and put them in our temple. Are you tracking with how bad this dude is? And all of this, this is where we see clearly God is sovereign in these things, but this was at the instigation of him inviting Tiglath-Pileser, who is going to destroy Syria and eventually the northern kingdom, and he's joining in with just how bad he is with Damascus and their temples. Are you seeing how narratively and historically this is just a crap show? Like, this is all bad. There's nothing good going on here, right? So he copies the altars in the temple, and things are going to get bad. You can read where he tours the temples there in chapter 16, verses 10 through 11, immediately after what we just read. But here's the next thing. How many times have we said when you see the pattern of the black hat and the white hat, you start to anticipate something else is going to happen? This is where the next thing happens. There's this cat named Hezekiah, who is Ahaz's son. He's going to come onto the throne after this guy. And he's going to be the first king in Israel who's actually going to do something about all those high places and all those idols. But he doesn't get the job done completely. He dies before he's done. He doesn't complete the task. So we'll spend a little bit of time on him, but we're going to come back around to him in a bit. Cool? All right, let me just halt right there. We track him with where we're talking about with Tiglath-Pileser and Syria, Assyria, and how all this stuff is working together. I know it's a lot to hold in your head at once, but it's going somewhere, I promise. All right. So we just had that introduction of Tiglath and how he's going to destroy Syria and then eventually Israel. And then we had this weird scene where the king of Judah goes up there to sing. Now let's actually talk about how Israel gets destroyed. Because the same guy, Tiglath-Pileser, is going to come and he's going to do the same to them. So there's this cat named Hoshea, who is the king in Israel, and he eventually becomes Assyria's vassal. There's a couple of battles fought. They take some land. And instead of getting destroyed, Hoshea says, you know what? I don't want to do this no more. We'll pay you money, right? So Tiglath-Pileser, he now moves on from the scene. Actually, he's a little bit after this cat, but the Shalmaneser is the king of Assyria at this point. But let's look at chapter 17. Chapter 17, verse 1. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, so we're referencing the time frame that we were just talking about, but now we're kind of back in time. The king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria, which is the capital of Israel, or over Israel, and he reigned 9 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Yeah, every one of the northern kings do so. Yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Oh, okay, so maybe we got a little bit of shining light. Maybe it's not going to be so bad. Next verse. Against him came up Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. You know what? I don't want to fight. Let's keep the nation alive. I'll give you money. Very next verse, verse 4. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, the king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. And therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. And then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. So Shalmaneser was expecting to get paid, right? You're my vassal. You don't want me to destroy you? Rock on. And then he noticed 1 year the money didn't show up. And the reason the money didn't show up is because he didn't send it to Assyria. He sent it to Egypt and said, hey, man, we bet on Syria. It didn't quite work out. How about you guys come help us out? And when Shalmaneser finds out that that's what happened, he comes to town. He goes to Samaria, he besieges it for 3 years, and says, one way or another, you're going to pay me. Either I'm going to kill everybody and take what I want, or you're going to pay me. He refused to pay. So Hoshea fails to pay the tribute. He conspired with the king. He eventually rebels, and then Shalmaneser imprisons Hoshea, and he besieges Israel. At the end of those 3 years, Assyria utterly destroys Samaria. They're going to get their pound of flesh one way or another. You want to pay that money to So, king of Egypt? Cool, rock on. Get all you boys out here in the street. We're about to pile them up. I want to read for you a quote. This is from a king who was 2 kings before Shalmaneser. And this is in what we would call the Black Obelisk. You can Google that and you can read the inscriptions that are in there. There's all sorts of really weird pictures, and you'll see what some of those weird pictures are about. This is a description of the Assyrians. You don't pay us our money, this is what happens. Their young men and their old I took as prisoners. Of some I cut off their feet and their hands, and of those and others I cut off the ears and noses and lips. And of the young men's ears I made a heap. And of the old men's heads I made a minaret. You know what a minaret is? A minaret, when you look at, think of Islam, when you think of a mosque where you've got like that big round dome, and then there are these 4 spires that come up, they're real thin, and they kind of have this bulbous kind of look to you. That's called a minaret. It's meant to be like 50 feet tall. What he says is, I cut all the young men's ears off and I made a heap, and all the old men's heads, I piled them up as tall as you could see it from 50 feet away, or from 50 feet tall. I piled their heads up. I exposed their heads as a trophy in front of their city. The male children and the female children I burned in flames, and the city I destroyed and I consumed with fire. The Assyrians had a really bad reputation because they were really good at siege warfare. They would use earthworks, so they would just, instead of building like huge machines to cross over walls, they would just send droves of slaves out there and they'd start digging and pile up dirt. You know what else they put in the dirt? The bodies of the slaves. Well, that's one less thing to dig. And they literally would build a ramp up to the wall, and then they would eventually cross the wall because they were going to come get their pound of flesh one way or another. These are the guys who were staring down the barrel at Israel. And so Assyria, they finally come, they destroy Samaria, they take the capital of Israel, and everyone else they scatter. And what we see is in chapter 17, verse 7. Read that for me in 2 Kings. And this, speaking of everything we just read, actually I didn't even read verse 6. Let's pick up verse 6. And if you have a subheading in your Bible like me, there is one verse that gets its own subheading here. And mine says, the fall of Israel. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Halach and in Habor and the river Gozan and the city of the Medes. Hold on to those cats. We'll see them in a bit. The city of the Medes. Verse 7. And all of this, them being carried off, occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs of the kings of Israel had practiced. That is exactly what Jeroboam had said earlier. Behold your gods who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I can draw a straight line from Jeroboam setting up 2 calves to the destruction of Israel that was already sealed all the way back then. Are you tracking with how with the finality of that, like how final that is, that setting up those 2 golden calves would lead to this almost immediately in many ways? I know there's a whole bunch of years and a whole bunch of kings in between, but this was only going to end one way. I mean, the author of 2 Kings says this happened because of their idolatry. Remember what I said about not preaching at us? Think about that again whenever you read this. So, this all happened in 722. The year 722, this is when Samaria is destroyed. The kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, they're done. From here, kingdom doesn't exist. They aren't going to be regathered together after some period of exile. They are scattered so much that we don't even know where most of them were at this point. Namely, because most of them are dead back at the capital, right? You know, the same guy who's going to be piling up a minaret of skulls is going to do the same thing with dudes' lips and ears and noses that he cut off in heaps. I don't know how many ears and noses and lips it takes to make a heap, but I don't see any reason why they would have flinched at this. One of the Assyrians' things that they really loved to do whenever they were parading around people that they captured is they would put a ring in someone's nose. It'd be attached to a chain. There'd be a hook. It would be hooked into the person in front of them. And that person would have a ring, could connected to a chain, to a hook. That's what happens to Israel. And I'm not trying to be theatrical here. I'm not trying to be dramatic in any way. But you have got to see this is what their sum result of idolatry was. God judged them. And he uses this abominable nation who's going to be judged later on, which we're going to see here in just a bit. But this is what happens, right? And I'm not saying that this is for us to, freak out and start thinking about our own failures and to think God's going to run a hook through our nose and through somebody else in front of us. That's not what I'm talking about here. But I am saying understand the seriousness of what God's covenant actually means. Because this is not a practical problem, it is a theological one. Yeah? All right. Questions about Assyria? Heavy stuff, I know. All right. So the next guy we're going to talk about is going to be Hezekiah. I don't actually have any notes on him just because he's not as important as Josiah. But I want you to remember one thing. Hezekiah is basically prefiguring Josiah and what he will do. What he begins, Josiah will complete as much as he can. He dies early. That's the only reason he doesn't finish the job, right? So let's look at Hezekiah. You can actually go and look in 2 Kings chapter 18. And you can see the story pick up with him. Hezekiah is there. He starts to put in a bunch of reforms. It doesn't always go well, but by just the force of the military and his decree as king, he makes a lot of this stuff happen. There's actually a scene, you can actually look in Acts chapter 19, where there's this cat named Isaiah. There's this cat named Isaiah, the same Isaiah who writes the book. Named after him. He's a prophet. He's of royal lineage, so he lives at the court in Jerusalem, right? He's actually related to Hezekiah in some way. I can't remember exactly how, but he actually saves Hezekiah's life. He's on the run, and Isaiah is the one who saves him. During this time, Isaiah is writing his prophecy. He is prophesying, he's preaching, he's out there doing all the things that we associate with Isaiah with this massive book. He's out there going and doing and training other people to be faithful to the covenants of God. Why do you think it is that Isaiah crops up at the same time as Hezekiah? It's because there's this return back to faithfulness to the Lord. Let's pick it up in chapter 18, verse 1. In the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, right? So this is right before they're about to die. Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, the king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaz dies. Then we get a little bit of that restoration and hope where God's going to provide there, because now Hezekiah is on the throne. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. He removed the high places, and he broke the pillars, and he cut down the Asherah poles, and he broke into pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. Wait, hang on. Isn't that crazy? Do y'all remember that story from Numbers 21, that all these snakes are rolling around in the camp and they're biting people and they're like gonna die? And so Moses has this bronze serpent, he lifts it up on a stick, and anyone who looks on it will be saved. That thing has been hanging around for the last 400 years. What do you think they were doing with that bronze snake? They were worshiping it. He broke into pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, and until those days, the people of Israel had made offerings to it, for it was called Neshatan. And he trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but he kept the commandments of the Lord that he commanded Moses, and the Lord was with him. Wherever he went out, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. Good on you, son. Good on you. Kind of, right? He would not submit to the king of Assyria. He rebelled, and he struck down the Philistines as far as Gaza to its territory, from the watchtower of the fortified city. And then eventually we're going to see that rebellion is going to get him on the run, and Isaiah is going to have to save him. Well, the problem with that is this puts Jerusalem on the map. You're going to rebel against Assyria, the guys who make piles of lips and noses and ears and minarets of skulls, and they've already whipped Egypt and destroyed Syria, and you're going to fight them, that kind of puts a bullseye on you. And that's basically what we see happening here. You can keep reading what happens with Hezekiah. Eventually, he's going to leave the scene, and his son, named Manasseh, is going to pick up the mantle, and he sucks. So all the things that Hezekiah did, Manasseh undoes. Right? You can read about him in 2 Kings chapter 21. It's all bad, right? It's all bad. He has a son named Ammon. He's also bad. Right? You seeing the pattern here? And it goes from bad to worse. And then we have this random cat named Josiah. Pick it up in chapter 22, verse 1. Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. You ever wondered why there's so many of these kings who show up when they're 15, 8, 21? That's because all the other kings were getting assassinated. That's because all the other kings were getting poisoned and killed, right? I mean, like crazy things are happening. This is going right back to Jeroboam. The harder that he tries to hold on to the things that he's earned and gained, the more it slips out of their hands, and eventually the throne lands on an 8-year-old. He was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 31 years, which was a remarkable length at this time. He reigns for 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedidiah, the daughter of Adaiah of Bozkath. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and he walked in all the way of David his father, and he did not turn aside to the right or to the left. Good on you. Josiah is Judah's final good king. You have Hezekiah, and then 3 guys later, basically, you've got Josiah. What all does he do? You can look in chapter 22, verses 3 through 7. He repairs the temple. This thing had been smacked around a little bit, right? Remember the Egyptian cat who basically rolled in on Rehoboam and stole a bunch of stuff? There was holes in the wall, and they hadn't been fixing, so he fixes it. And as they're doing that, there's this crazy scene. Pick it up in chapter 22, verse 8. 22, verse 8. And Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan, the secretary, I found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. Yeah, that's kind of where it should be, right? Why are you just now discovering it? So the book of the law is rediscovered. They're like, hey man, we found this book. What are we supposed to do with it? And so Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. And Shaphan, the secretary, came to the king and reported to the king, your servants had emptied out the money that was found in the house and had delivered it into the hand of the workmen in the oversight of the house of the Lord. Like, we got to pay to rebuild the temple, and while they're in there, they found the Bible, right? They find the Hebrew Bible. Most likely it's the Pentateuch, it's the law of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. They find that, and they're like, hey, what are we supposed to do with this thing? So they bring it to the guys in charge. And so then Shaphan, the secretary, told the king, Hilkiah, the high priest, or the priest, has given me a book. And they read it before the king. And when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. What happens there is that there's an immediate and instant revival. And this is going to be the only other time I'm going to preach at us tonight. Revival breaks out when God's people read God's word. Imagine that. Because it's not about the commands of do's and don'ts. It's not about the things that tell about history. It's about God's clear projection of his blessing onto us because he loves us. Whenever people tell me that the Bible is just a list of do's and don'ts, I'm like, man, you're reading the wrong parts. Because even the parts that are the do's and don'ts are for our joy and so that we might gain more blessing. Like, you're not even looking at it the right way, even if it were a list of do's and don'ts, which it isn't. They read the first 5 books of the Bible and instantly revival breaks out. When's the last time we even really looked at those 5 books? When's the last time you read your most prized book in the Bible that speaks to you the most? Maybe if we actually thought that God spoke to us today through that we would do it more frequently. So, there is this instant revival that breaks out because they read the Bible. Imagine that. And then, pick it up in chapter 23, verse 5. Well, actually, let's do one more. Go to chapter 23, 1 and 2 before we get there. The king sent, and all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem were gathered to him, and the king went up to the house of the Lord, and with him all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the prophets and the priests, all the people, both great and small. Everybody Get out of your house, come here now. Don't care what you're doing, get here now. I'm the king, get here now. They get there, and he read, and they're hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that have been found in the house of the Lord. That word, it's found, like, that's scary. That's scary, is it not? Like, the thing that is the covenantal basis of them understanding their own history and their relationship to God, they had forgotten about so long that the next time they run into it, it's considered found. And the king stood by the pillar, and he made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all of his soul, to perform the words of this covenant that are written in this book. And all the people joined in the covenant. This is one of the very few times in these few books that we've looked at in 1st and 2nd Kings that we see the covenant actually reaffirmed in any positive way. It's because they read it. Pick it up in verse 5. Let's pick it up in just 4. Let's keep going. And the king commanded Hilkiah, the high priest, and the priests of the second order, and the keepers of the threshold, to bring out the temple of the Lord, all the vessels made for Baal and Asherah, and all the host of heaven, including that weird altar that showed up when Ahaz was king, right? That weird thing that's been lingering around. I don't know why it's here. Get rid of it, right? It ain't supposed to be here. And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields and the Kidron, and he carried off the ashes to Bethel. Why did he take it to Bethel? Because that was the last place that there was actually a couple of calves that were golden. And there's this random old prophet who had told this cat named Jeroboam, hey, there's going to be ashes that are going to be burned on top of this. Are you seeing that? Josiah knew what God had commanded him to do, and he did it. It's not a practical issue, it's a theological one about our obedience. So he takes it up there to Bethel in verse 5, and he deposed the priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to make offerings in the high places in the cities of Judah and around Jerusalem, and also who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and the moon and the constellations and the hosts of the heavens. And he brought out from the Asherah the house of the Lord outside of Jerusalem in the book of Kidron, and he burned it in the book of Kidron, and he beat it to dust. Why did he beat it to dust? Because that's exactly what Moses did to the first golden calf. And he beat it to dust. And he gave it, spread it upon the graves of the common people, and he broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes and all who were in the house of the Lord, where women wove hangings for the Asherah, and he brought all the priests out of the cities. Are you getting what he's doing here? Homeboy is cleaning house. And if it weren't for his early demise, it would have been finished. But at this point, all idolatry is removed. That is great. Covenantal faithfulness is coming back. One more thing. Look at chapter 23, verse 21. And the king commanded all the people, keep the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in the book of the covenant. This book, the one we found, the one that Moses wrote about Exodus. Yeah? We just read that. Let's do the thing that it told us to do. Novel idea, right? For no such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel or the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. The Passover was finally restored because it hadn't been kept this whole time. Are you seeing how revival leads to obedience? And the opening parts of that is by doing a basic act of obedience. Hey man, the temple's in ruins, man. Let's fix it up. Cool. Let's go fix it up. Oh, we got to pay the guys. Let's go get some money out of that room that we really don't ever go into. And they get some money, and they find a book, and they read it, and that leads to this eye-opening experience where they recognize they're supposed to be obedient, and the next things that start happening is we start getting rid of all the things that aren't supposed to be there, and we start doing the things that we're supposed to do. That's how this works out on a national scale. Tracking with that? So, all this is going on. Look ahead to chapter 23, verse 29. Let's pick it up in verse 28. You may have a subheading there that kind of gives the whole game away, right? Pick it up in verse 28. Now the rest of the acts of Josiah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And in his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria and to the river Euphrates. Now, how is it that Assyria is still around? Well, it's because we're Tarantinoing this thing, right? This is all the same time happening, even though we've already discussed Syria as being destroyed. This is before then, right? Are you tracking with the chronology here? So all this is going on. Why is Egypt going to fight with Assyria? Or excuse me, go fight with Syria? That's because, we'll get there in a second. In the days of Pharaoh, Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to fight to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went to meet him, and Pharaoh and Necho killed him at Megiddo as soon as he saw him. So it seems as though Josiah had been out there and he had captured this fort that's at Megiddo. There's a whole other thing that happens in the intertestamental period that hopefully we'll be able to get to tomorrow night with Megiddo. Really sad scene in Jewish history takes place there later. But he takes this fort, and as soon as Necho gets there, sees him, homeboy catches an arrow in the gut, he dies. Right there. Like he doesn't even make it back to Jerusalem, right? So Josiah goes to halt King Necho's attempts to fight with Assyria, and he dies. Verse 30, and his servants carried him dead in the chariot from Megiddo and brought him to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb. And the people of the land took Jehoaz, the son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king after his father's place. And that dude's a dirtbag. Early death leads to this right now. Now, just kind of take a big step back. This is now in the year 609. So this is a pretty good chunk away from some of the other stuff we're going to talk about. But here's the point. The Egyptians were going up to fight with the Assyrians because what was going on then is the Assyrians were on the run. And the guys they were on the run from were these random dudes from Mesopotamia that they had sacked earlier called the Babylonians. So now the Babylonians are starting to come on the stage a little bit more prominently. They start getting more help, and the only other superpower in the region is Egypt. And so Egypt is going to make that run up the coast of the Mediterranean where Megiddo is. They're going to make the run up the coast, link up with Assyria, they're going to fight. And Josiah said, we can't be doing that. Remember, I rebelled, or my predecessor Hezekiah rebelled against the Assyrians, and this is all getting sideways on us. We can't have you crossing through our land. And he makes it through. Takes an arrow in the gut for his troubles and dies. Are you tracking with that? You're seeing how now the Assyrians are up there fighting. I misspoke earlier when I said that Syria, they were linking up with them. This is Assyria now fighting the Babylonians. Okay? So I kind of misspoke earlier. Might be. Are we tracking with that? All right. So that brings us to the Babylonian ascent and the Assyrian decline. The Assyrians were now fighting these random guys that they had fought, a generation or two earlier, called the Babylonians, down at the Mesopotamian area region between the two rivers, right? They had sacked their temples, took everything back up there to what was Asia Minor. And Necho's going up there to meet up with them so that they can have this fight. Babylon is almost always the answer. They have always got their claws in at some point, maybe small, maybe big, but they're always around somewhere because they are in such a strategic location. They're kind of in the middle of a desert, but there is a great river that goes and traverses this massive stretch in that desert, and there's Babylon right there in the middle of it, right? We're tracking with that? So here's the first thing I want you to see. Assyria had consolidated all of their power over Syria and Israel, and they had sacked Babel. However, they hadn't actually consolidated the power and actually started to rule over the Babylonians. They just went over there and took all their stuff and went back home. Make sense? And so what's Babylon going to do? Like, wouldn't you be pretty ticked off if they took all your stuff? You're going to do everything in your power to rebel if needed, but definitely to fight back. And so after a certain amount of time, Babylon started gaining their strength back. They start consolidating power along the Tigris and the Euphrates. They start bringing people together. They start massing all their forces. And then the Babylonians rebel against the Assyrians. Are you tracking with me here? So now the Assyrians, the ones who had already a couple generations ago had sacked Babylon, are now being rebelled against by these guys. They were supposed to be fighting with them. And then there's the Battle of Nineveh in 612. The Battle of Nineveh is one of those critical times that literally undoes an entire empire. Nineveh falls. And there's this random cat that you're probably going to recognize here in a moment that helps with them. The Assyrians were calling on the Egyptians for help. The Egyptians get up there. They lose too. The Egyptians leave. And so now we got a whole mess And there's this cat named Nebuchadnezzar who's in charge of the Babylonians. He's the one who had been consolidating their power. He's the one who had been gathering all their forces. He's the one who defeated them. Nebuchadnezzar, and then a little bit later on, we're going to talk about a cat that you're going to recognize. There's two battles. One of them is this is one location, two different battles. The Battle of Carchemish. And Nebuchadnezzar makes a name for himself there. They go to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, raise it, and this is actually the book of Nahum. The entire book of Nahum is about this event with Nebuchadnezzar destroying Nineveh. All right, Jonah is when Israel is still a country at this point, and he is prophesying in Nineveh, and Nineveh repents. And then like 2 generations later, they go all bad, and they start piling up people's lips and noses and ears, right? And then whenever they are destroyed, Nahum is on the scene, and he's talking about their destruction. Nineveh was a city that had multiple gates and a couple of rivers. They were like basically canals. They would block off these rivers. And what the Babylonians did is they figured out how to knock those wedges out from underneath the gates, and they basically flooded the city. They used the wall of the city, and they just blocked up the river and let it fill it up. And that's how they destroyed Nineveh. These guys, as much as the Assyrians were bad hombres, Babylonians are just as bad, if not worse. And there's a specific brand of Babylonians named the Chaldeans who are about the worst dudes of the group. The Chaldeans are the ones that we see Habakkuk. God tells Habakkuk, hey, I'm going to send the Chaldeans. They're coming after you all. These are all the same people we're talking about in Babylon. Yeah? We tracking with that? Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar eventually takes over Assyria, and whenever he takes over Assyria, all of Assyria's vassals are now his vassals. You were paying whoever the king was in Nineveh X amount of money. Cool. Don't pay him anymore. Just give it to me. He was going to give it to me anyway, so just cut the middleman out, give it to me. Well, Jehoiakim is now the king. Let's pick it up there in chapter 23, verse 36, so the very end of the chapter. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. Rather, short reign. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers had done. Verse 1 of chapter 24. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. All right, man, I'm not going to pay the Assyrians, I'll pay you. Right? And we're going to make sure that you don't come knocking on our door, I'll pay you. He did that for 3 years, and then he turned and rebelled against him. And this is where things really start going bad. So Jehoiakim initially submits, and then eventually rebels. And this is the pattern we are going to see, which, by the way, let's have a little bit of humanity here. What would you do? Like, if you felt that you had this God-given right, which he correctly did in some sense, right? He is the king to defend the people. Man, I don't know if defending the people looks like paying everything you got to somebody else so they don't kill you, holding you at ransom. I don't necessarily blame him for that. But at the same time, what we also have to have is more perspective to say, yeah, but this is going to end poorly, not because you're a bad commander or because you don't have enough money, but because of your idolatry. That's not something that was, that was really on the forefront of his mind. So, Jehoiakim, actually, let me read this. Turn to Jeremiah real quick. Jeremiah chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 7. So this is Jeremiah saying, we'll pick it up in verse 5. Declare in Judah and proclaim in Jerusalem and say, blow the trumpet through the land, cry aloud and say, assemble and let us go into the fortified cities. A fight's coming. Y'all better get ready. This is going down. Verse 6, raise a standard toward Zion, flee for safety, stay not, for I bring disaster from the north. Where are the Babylonians going to come from? Well, they are situated east of Israel. Problem is, there's a big old desert there. And so the way you get to Israel from the east is you go up north, and then you come down south. Are you tracking with that? There's an enemy coming from north, and great destruction. A lion has gone up from his thicket, a destroyer of nations has set out, and he has gone from his place. That title, Destroyer of Nations, was actually a title that Nebuchadnezzar used and would say, this is who we are as a people. As Nebuchadnezzar, he took on the title as Destroyer of Nations, and we're about to see it take place. Are you tracking with me there? So, any questions about what we talked about with Josiah all the way down to Jehoiakim? We're almost done. All right. So, Nebuchadnezzar subjugates Judah. They're supposed to be paying money. They do for 3 years, and then Jehoiakim rebels. This is the first rebellion. We saw that in chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. He initially wasn't rebelling. He initially was paying, but then he stopped. Yeah? So now, he comes down there and puts an end to it. Let's just say it that way. Jehoiakim rebels. Nebuchadnezzar comes and basically takes a whole bunch of people captive. He says, all right, if you don't want to pay, that's cool. I'm going to take about 10,000 people. They're going to come back home with me. If you don't pay, I kill every one of them. Make sense? So they install another king, Jehoiachin. And Jehoiachin, in chapter 24, pick it up in verse 18, he eventually screws up. He gets deported. Chapter 24, verse 18, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutul, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah, a different Jeremiah. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For because of the anger of the Lord, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast out from his presence, and Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. Guys, it didn't work the first time. Why do you think it's going to work this time? Well, now Jerusalem's going to get invaded again. Zedekiah was installed. It all goes bad, and then he rebels. Are you tracking with the pattern here? We don't like the old king, we'll get rid of him, we'll put a new one in, it goes well for a time, and then he rebels. We come back. There are eventually 3 different sieges of Jerusalem, and this time, when Jerusalem is sieged, there won't be a 4th. Because whenever they siege Jerusalem, they're going to raze it to the ground. They are going to destroy everything they can. And this is when Solomon's temple is actually destroyed. This is when the palace is destroyed. Are you tracking with all that? So, all that being said, let's drive on into chapter 25, verse 7. This is a sad state of affairs. Pick it up in verse 6. We're speaking of Zedekiah here. And then they captured the king, Zedekiah. They brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and they passed sentence on him. And they slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Oh, you want to rebel? Go get the other 10,000 folks. But we're going to start with your sons. They grab all his sons. They kill them all right in front of him. And then after they kill his sons, they put out his eyes. They blinded him. They bound him in chains, and they took him to Babylon. This is what happens whenever you rebel against Babylon. Are you tracking with me? That's how big a deal this is. He's blinded, then arrested, the temple's plundered, it's destroyed, and then exile is what's going to happen to the rest of Judah. So whereas the Assyrians, whenever they came through and destroyed everything, they destroyed it, they killed everybody, they sent everybody packing, and that was the end of it. Yeah? This time, when it comes to Jerusalem, we're not going to just destroy everything and then kill everyone. We're going to take everyone hostage, and we're all going back to Babylon. That is now where we see what Jeremiah has been saying all along. There are people coming, and we're going to be there for a while. So, let's quickly talk about the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah, like I just said, warned of this, but he also said in Jeremiah 29, 5 and 6, he says, build houses there, get planted, build houses, plant orchards, have wives, be good to the city, and pray for its good. You're going to be there for a while. You better make the most of it, in essence. At this time, there was at least 20,000 people who were captive in Babylon, but there are at least 6 other cities that are mentioned by name where there are other captives from Judah who are there. Are you tracking with that? So there are a bunch more than 20,000, but there's at least 20,000 there in Babylon. They were allowed to build houses, but here's the thing. Daniel is the only person who actually gives us real-time explanations of what's going on there in Babylon. Esther is a little bit beyond Daniel. So we're talking about like the beginning of the exile up until halfway through whenever there's a seed change in those who are in the leadership in Babylon, because that's what happens in Daniel chapter 5 and 6. We'll get there in just a moment. But they are actually there for at least 70 years. You're going to be there for a while, 70 years. During this time, as soon as they were shipped off to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar continues his reign and his campaign, and he actually besieges Tyre, which is one of those old cities that actually had helped Israel build the temple right? Tyre and Sidon. They'd actually given lumber and all sorts of stuff from the nation of Lebanon. He besieges them for 13 years. They have a port city. Nebuchadnezzar is a guy who literally lives in the desert, doesn't have any boats. You know what he does? He starts cutting down trees miles and miles away. They build the boats and they drag them to the sea. And they besiege this city for 13 years until it falls. This dude is the destroyer of nations, right? So he goes, he's there doing all of his stuff out on campaign. He eventually comes back to Babylon. He's there for a time. Eventually he dies. And then there's an unfortunate series of kings who succeed him, and they all suck. Like they're all bad kings in Babylon. None of them were as good at the military shtick, and none of them were as good administratively with this huge empire, and it just goes from bad to worse. And eventually we get to this cat named Belshazzar. And Belshazzar is the dude that we see in Daniel chapter 5. So let's go to Daniel chapter 5 real quick. So you're going to have to go a pretty good chunk all the way over past Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Daniel chapter 5, pick it up in verse 1. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and he drank wine in front of 1,000. And he keeps going on. This is just the scene of the handwriting on the wall. Here in chapter 5, he's called the last king of Babel, because he eventually would be, essentially. There's a couple of other rulers who will be there for a bit, but he is the last dude who rules in Babylon. And we get to see in real time Daniel live through all this, yeah? So, now we've got the Babylonians are now on the outs. And who do we have taking their place? The Persians. So let's just recap so far. We've got the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians. Tomorrow night we will look at the Greeks and then the Romans, who are a little bit further away. That's just kind of this evolution of these empires who are going to be ruling all the way through this. Are you tracking with that? So, here we go. This is where we have now basically departed where the scriptures speak to any of these things. We see the results of it, but we don't actually see how these things take place because this wasn't in the purview of Daniel at the time of his writing. Are you tracking with that? So tonight, for the next 5 minutes or so until the end of tomorrow, we're going to be doing a lot of talking about just history stuff and not necessarily scripture. Yeah? So, after Nebuchadnezzar dies, a whole bunch of weak kings ruled after him. And then we have the Persians, which we were going to call the Persians, but really more specifically, they're called the Medo-Persians, or the Medes, Median, and the Persians, right? The Medes are a people who are from on the northern plateau of Iran, which eventually stretches all the way through Afghanistan, all the way through Pakistan, and into India. This is where some of the steppe people that Alexander the Great's going to fight for decades are going to be lingering around with the Greeks. They come from this area, right? The Medes. The Persians, more precisely, are from the southern area of what we would call Iran today, right? That's the flat ground. That's where you start getting closer to down there in the Persian Gulf, what we know of it today. That's where these guys are from. These guys are excellent fighters, right? So the Persians are the Medo-Persians. We're just going to call them the Persians because that's just easier for us, right? But they're technically two different people. Now, there's this cat named Cyaxares. Cyaxares is actually going to gather those two groups, and he's going to gather them so that they can fight. And he is actually the guy that the Babylonians and the Assyrians are fighting. When the Babylonians are fighting the Assyrians and Necho is coming up from Egypt to come help the Assyrians fight, this cat Cyaxares is actually one of the guys who's helping the Babylonians there fight them. So we start seeing the nascent form of like this great general who is gathering the Medes and the Persians as one fighting force, fighting on behalf of the Babylonians some 20 years, 30 years earlier, right? And now he's gathering, consolidating his power, right? The next guy that we see from there is this cat named Cambyses. Cambyses is actually going to marry into that guy's family, and his son is the one you need to remember, Cyrus. And Cyrus the Great is two people away from the guy who actually unites the Medes and the Persians. You can think of it that way. Now, Cyrus is the one who officially unites these groups, and he's the one that whenever he unites them, for the first time in our narrative, people aren't moving towards Israel, he actually goes to India. So he starts conquering everything from what is Iran, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, India. He conquers all of that. Because it's all basically the same kind of land of, you've got like the steppes and the northern plains before you start hitting the Himalayas, and then you've got all the flat ground down towards what is eventually the Indian Ocean. All of that's like where his people are from, so they just start sweeping east. After he does all that, he turns around, and the only other place for him to go, unless you want to cross the Himalayas, is Babylon. And so eventually Cyrus defeats the Babylonians at Ophis. At this point, the Babylonians have basically abandoned Babylon. It's an indefensible position for them. They can't do it. All these weak kings had been retreating away from there and actually leaving what they were supposed to be doing. And so they keep moving capitals, right? But Babylon is still like the capital, even though the king isn't there. So Cyrus marches at Ophis. He defeats the Babylonian army. And when he's done there, he turns and walks into Babylon uncontested. He literally just walks into the city. And this is where in Daniel we start talking from about Belshazzar to then Cyrus. Now there's also this other cat named Darius who's really in charge there in Babylon. It's unclear what the relation between Darius and Cyrus is, but we can pick it up there in Daniel chapter 5, verse 28. Let's pick it up in verse 29. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel, with his clothes and his purple and a chain of gold, put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he would be the third ruler in the kingdom. And then that night, Belshazzar the Chaldean was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. A little bit later on, we'll see not only is Darius mentioned there. Look at the very end of chapter 6, verse 28. And so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So what's happened so far is now the Babylonians are no longer in the picture. And all you have left now are the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Medes, Cyrus, and eventually we'll start seeing some more of these cats a little bit later tomorrow. Yeah? All right, so this is where we've been. We went from the division of the kingdom, Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and their fiasco. The Assyrians come on the scene. They destroy Syria. They destroy the northern kingdom. And then we see Josiah come, where there's breathing a little bit of life into the southern kingdom, and then immediately it goes south from there. Babylonians take over. The Persians take over the Babylonians. And that will then bring us tomorrow to all of this. And the big one we're going to be talking about there is the ascent of the Greeks. And when I say the Greeks, that's just generally what we refer to them as, but to be more specific, the Greeks are really the Macedonians, because Alexander the Great is actually the son of Philip II of Macedon. So when we say the Greeks, Macedonians, same people. So the Greeks are going to be the ones who take over the empire from the Persians, and all that land, all the way to India, Alexander will literally walk. He'll conquer all the way what Cyrus did. He's going to track the same exact way. He's eventually going to get all the way to the Hydaspes River, turn around, and he dies before they makes it back home. And that's where we'll pick up with the Romans and the Hasmoneans and everything that goes on there. Yeah? Questions, comments, concerns, gripes, complaints. What questions do you have about the division of the kingdom all the way to now there is no Israeli nation? There is no Israelite nation at all. Israel or Judah otherwise. Questions? Did any or all of that make sense? This is going to be really critical, and I'm doing my best to avoid maps and charts and that kind of jazz. But if you've ever heard anything about this escalation, about the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, depending on different interpretations of how you read Daniel chapter 7 and 9, there are these four nations. A lot of people identify those four nations as the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans, right? Or if you want to take the road less traveled, you start with the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks. Are you tracking with me? So this actually does have real-world consequences whenever we read our Bibles when we're looking at Daniel. Now, I don't want to make too much of it, because what we're talking about here is really getting to that point of how do we arrive in Jesus' day, where we were at one time speaking nothing but Hebrew and writing nothing but Hebrew. And then when Jesus shows up, he's speaking Aramaic, Greek, everything's written in Greek, and the Romans are in charge. This is why this stuff is important, because that explains how we got there. Yeah? All right. Final thoughts. Let me pray for us. Father, I thank you for the way that we can see your guiding hand through history and how you are sovereign. God, I pray that you would cause us to understand that there are real world effects for us understanding how it is that our relationship to you and our fidelity to you and our obedience to you actually has consequences, maybe not on the macro scale like the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom experienced with their idolatry, but there are real world consequences, and there really are impacts in our lives and a loss of blessing because of what we choose to do on a daily basis. God, I pray that we would look at these lessons that we've learned just from this turning over of kingdoms over and over to see that you are the one who is sovereign and that you are absolutely the one who is in charge of nations, but you are also the one who is in charge of us. And so, God, I thank you for your covenantal faithfulness, for your hesed love and the way that you do not depart from us and that you refuse to give up on the covenants that you've made even whenever we fail. And God, we thank you for that, because that is what brings to us Christ. That's what brings to us the birth of Jesus and his life and his death, his burial and his resurrection. And Father, I thank you for that. God, I pray that we would be more mindful of how these things impact us even today. And we pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. All right. If you got any questions, hang around here. If not, hopefully we got something recorded. I saw we had some technical issues back there, but hey, we'll go from there. Y'all have a good night.